Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Julia Ferraioli, who is a co-founder of Open Source Stories and is currently working at AWS as an open source artificial intelligence and machine learning strategist. Julia joins us from Seattle, Washington, in the United States. Julia Ferraioli, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you, Robby. I appreciate being here.
It only took you a few nudges. You're a very busy person, so I appreciate you spending some time with us and our listeners. So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
This depends so highly on the industry, the programming language, bunch of different factors that I think we don't dig enough into in terms of nuance. But I think the biggest ones that would top my list regardless, a lack of what people often term clever code. And this is uncomfortable for so many people because we're so proud of when we get the structure, the performance, everything just right. And it's perfect, it's gorgeous, it's poetry, but it's completely unmaintainable. Oftentimes, even to the person who wrote it 5 minutes later.
Do you feel like that's because people just inherently want to be clever?
Programming languages give us so many ways to do things, whether it's writing loops, whether it's writing how to shift bits here and there. We have a lot of different ways to perform the same functionality. And sometimes it's a matter of pride for the person writing the code, what advanced features of the programming language they take advantage of. And for that type of programming or software engineering, it winds up being something you have to go to documentation for to actually get right. And then you immediately forget because we all have the memory of a sparrow. But I do think that there's some matter of pride, and it goes back to the whole idea of software being a creative endeavor instead of just an assembly endeavor. And I mean that in the putting things together, not the assembly programming language or writing in assembly, which I did a few times and I don't really want to do again. But I think there's that part of the cleverness that draws people to it. And then a lot of engineers, a lot of us are numbers driven. And so if there's a way to get the lines of code down or the length of a line down so that it doesn't have to wrap or what have you in your editor, whatever editor you may use. Yeah, a lot of us kind of do that, even if it's subconscious. And when it comes to debugging that code or changing it later or passing it along to the next person, it just becomes a lot less maintainable.
This is interesting. I totally understand that, there's a creative process versus like an assembly process, and how are we building things today that make our lives easier tomorrow, or the next person that's going to come along and inherit the project or code that we're writing today. Like you mentioned, like if you're using some obscure feature or method or in the programming language that you're currently working at, there must be some reason why that method exists, right? So someone thought it was a good idea and decided that this should be part of the core functionality of the programming language. So might there be a counter like, well, the other people just should maybe learn more about everything that this language does so that they can also take advantage of these sophisticated things. And this is why our programming language is so amazing. Maybe it gets back to the pride thing, but it's just, is it a matter of like, if you use these more, I'm air quoting, advanced or more obscure, hidden things that you may more often need to look up the documentation for and be like, what exactly does this do? How is this working? Why is this different than this other thing? What is this gaining us? Might there be a counter argument that like, well, I'm planting the flag out here. I think our team and our future team can get to this point where we can all take advantage and write code like this. So I'm going to plant the flag and people will follow. Maybe that doesn't work in reality.
I I think that's a completely understandable position to take. And I'll take a very maybe controversial, maybe not controversial position here and use the example of the ternary operator. This is something has been around for, I don't know, a very, very long time, decades in various programming languages. And it's kind of come along for the ride in most modern programming languages as well. And I will forever maintain, and yes, I will continue using maintain as a pun throughout this recording, I will forever maintain that it reduces the maintainability of software. The ternary operator was introduced at a time where file sizes mattered. I mean, they still do. I want to be clear. File sizes still matter, but getting the number of characters in a file down as much as you possibly could mattered because space was constrained. And so, do I know 100% for sure that was the reason the ternary operator was introduced? No, that's my intuition. But it's kind of come along and been incorporated into programming languages since, even if file sizes were less important. It is one of those things where, yes, you can internalize how the ternary operator works. Absolutely. It is pretty standard across every implementation in programming languages. But from a cognitive overhead perspective, even if you know exactly how it works and what it does, it makes the code less readable from a flow angle. So when you're going through code line by line, character by character, it doesn't follow the same logical structure as we expect from readable code and well understood code. And it also, like if you're using a programming language with a well designed and well implemented debugger, I don't know, you can 100% know what's going on there. And it still is not a great experience if you're stepping through the code and trying to debug it. So you can plant your flag. It can be a matter of, yes, we're going to set the bar this high and we're going to all understand without a doubt what the ternary operator does. But at the same time, is that a matter of pride or is that a matter of usability and readability?
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus they're certified ISO 27001 and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. No, I appreciate that perspective, and I'm definitely not going to take the side of use the obscure things in a programming language necessarily. I think there's times and places where maybe there's a good argument for it, but you make a good point also around like when some of these things were designed, file space, disk space, things getting shipped to on physical hardware. A lot of things we've inherited. I'm kind of air quoting. We live in an era of abundance of disk space and of memory storage, and things are rather fast now. And in some ways, our laptops are faster than the servers we're often running our apps on. And it's a lot of interesting things to think about. And it's funny because like I often get some, you may or may not know this, but I have a project called Oh My Z Shell, and I sometimes get some flack because there's too much. I'm air quoting bloated, because it includes hundreds of text files that have a little bit of code in each of those files, because it comes with hundreds of files for all these different themes and plugins. And I'm like, it's literally just like 20 lines of code in this little text file. It's a plain text file. It's not, I don't even know what the disk space it takes up, but it's not very much. But I'll get it's bloated. So for what it's worth, I guess I could make it more compact, and I think people would be still complaining about that. But that's just the nature of open source, which is a topic that I wanted to get into with you. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about open source stories and some of your most favorite episodes of conversations that you've had?
So open source stories really was born out of a bunch of different conversations with people who've been involved in open source for either a long time or very little time, and the challenges and kind of history that they found working in open source. And a lot of the stories that myself and my co-founder, Amanda Kasseri, heard weren't documented anywhere. They weren't published. They're definitely not in the commit history of any open source project. And for some of these stories, they were A, really important, and B, included a lot of cultural context that is important for understanding open source at large. And so one of the things that we decided to do was create this narrative project where we would go and we would give people involved in open source an opportunity to tell the stories that they wanted known. And that's a really powerful thing, especially when open source and experiences within open source are subject to such problems of erasure. People who have left open source for some reason or another, or people who don't get credit for what they do within open source. And I might be projecting a little bit because this has happened to me as well. But we were privileged enough to have you come on Open Source Stories, which to tell the story of Oh My Z Shell, which I now know how to pronounce properly. Thank you. And we've also had designers, people who work in accessibility, talk about their experiences working within open source, and in some cases, why they've left. And there's no exit interview for open source. Exit interviews might be common in companies, but there's not an exit interview for why you left an open source project. And when people talk about everyone is welcome in open source, that's not always true. And there's a lot of people who leave silently for various reasons, and that gets attributed to lack of interest or lack of priority or changing priorities, etc. And I think it's important to highlight the good and the bad of how people engage within open source. And so it's an opportunity for people to tell their stories. And it's, I don't know, we keep it fairly informal. This is a much more professional podcast than the narrative project that we're running.
No, thanks for the kind of overview and introduction for kind of what prompted it. One of the things, it's interesting thinking about like exit interviews in open source and capturing like the stories of people that have made things and are still doing it, or maybe they no longer doing it, what have you. Also knowing that some people do come into this space and try to contribute to open source and are met with challenges. Maybe I'm assuming, you're probably my assumption is you're probably not speaking to people that weren't able to get to make much of a contribution, but people that were able to contribute and then for one reason or another decided to stop doing it. Because I know sometimes there's a barrier, whether that sometimes is an actual barrier from the people maintaining the project already and running the project versus I've also met a lot of people with their barrier is just themselves and feeling like I'm not good enough, I'm not ready, who am I to contribute? That's why I always like to share my story. I'm like, who was I to make Oh My Z Shell? I'm like, the secret's out. I actually don't know that much about coding in Z Shell. So yet I did it. I'm more of a, trying to reframe it of, was I the creator or was I the curator of Oh My Z Shell? And I like that word is kind of an interesting one. But someone else gave it, I don't remember who planted that seed in my head, but I've been leaning on that lately. But I'm curious about you capturing these stories. Do you find that people are able to be as open as you hope they can be in these conversations, maybe during like a open source exit interview type of scenario, or is it very open because they've got a few things to say?
It's funny that you say the exit interview because I was just thinking, oh, maybe I should send people surveys afterwards and see how they felt. So we do try to keep it so that people can be there as open and authentic as they want to be. And I think that's as they want to be is important. I won't name names, but we have recorded a couple that in retrospect, the participant said, no, actually, please don't publish that. I'm not actually comfortable what I said being published, or can you take out this particular portion? And I think that part of having agency over your story and how it's told is a critical part of what we try to do with open source stories, because the last thing we want to do with surfacing these undertold narratives or untold narratives is to further compromise the person's agency over how they show up. So I think I believe they're showing up authentically and being open and honest, or at least to the extent that they want to be. And we've had a number of them that don't really pull punches. Could they have not pulled punches further? Probably. But again, at the end of the day, the internet lives forever. And so we want people to be comfortable with what they say living forever, which is actually even more important because we back all of our stories up into the U.S. Library of Congress.
That's wonderful. As you said, the internet's kind of forever. It's also not forever. And sometimes, so I'm glad to hear you're getting things backed up. I know of a few podcasts that I've even been a participant on where I'm like, oh, I remember that conversation, that I cannot track it down because the company stopped doing it. And then it's just a 404 somewhere or a dead domain. And I'm like, what happened? Oh no, where's the MP3? Why didn't I download it? And so I just, not that I need to go back and spend that much time listening to my own stories, but it's just when I'm trying to do some like digital archiving of my own stuff, and like, what was I thinking about 15 years ago? Because that is like a thing one of the things I like about this medium is I can go back and see what I wrote and I felt ready to publish, but what I might have just said off the cuff in a conversation is sometimes very different. And I'm like, oh, look how far I've grown since then. All right, I'm diverting from my next topic, which we should get to. So thinking about open source in particular, and I know that you've been around in the open source community for a while. I think I heard you on another podcast talk about, you remember the era of SourceForge. And if people looked and they knew how to find my old code, there's some very embarrassing code out that I written that's probably still available on SourceForge. I'm not going to tell you what it is, and I didn't use my real name back then. So I'm curious, do you find that it's more or less, for people new to the industry, what do you think their perspective, do you think it's more of a challenge today making sense of the open source community than it was, say, 20 years ago? And maybe just, regardless of like how much bigger it is, I guess in size, but in terms of, does it look a lot different and smell a lot different?
Well, I think there are a couple of different angles to that question. I think it is easier than ever to discover open source, as well as open source projects and communities that they may want to take part in. There's so much more education around how to participate in open source, but there's also a lot of very conflicting education about how to participate in open source. And so it is both easier and harder at the same time. I think that from the era of SourceForge, I don't know how extensively you used some of the more community-focused features of SourceForge, but my attempts to engage with community there did not bear fruit. I still fell in love with the power of open source and how it connected communities, in my case, researchers from New Zealand to Texas. Like, that day and age was absolutely mind-blowing. But there was no one like answering questions, responding to issues. Like, that was not a thing. And maybe that's just because it was academic software. I'm not really sure. So I think that nowadays, the community features, the community support, and how people show up for each other as people, as they're invested in building up the next generation of contributors and users, that is a whole lot better. From a technical standpoint, I think it is a lot harder for a couple of important reasons. The first is that I know you said not to say that like there's so much more open source software out there, but the software that we have is so much more complex. Like, when was the last time you downloaded a piece of open source software that didn't have a single dependency, or you didn't have to go and install a specialized environment to run it in, or spin up a Docker container, or what have you. And so the complexity of our software has gotten so much bigger. And that does make it harder for people to really get involved in engineering open source software. And then the other side of it is that we have built increasingly complex layers of abstraction into not just the software, but the platforms that underpin open source. And this might be my pet peeve a little bit, but there are a large number of people who believe that Git and GitHub are the same thing. And so when we talk about open source, and yes, there are still other version control systems, I understand this. By and large, open source is kind of standardized on Git. But when I talk to people about how they interact with code and how metrics kind of show up in software, and especially in research, I do have to explain, actually Git and GitHub are very, very different, and they show up very differently when you're doing analysis on software. And that's just one example, but these things matter. They have led us into the beautiful ecosystem that we have currently, but they introduce some additional challenges as well.
You know, you talk about abstraction and also thinking about just the Git and GitHub thing. And yes, there's GitLab and other platforms and other version control software that people are still using. OMyZShell supports other things beyond Git. You've used Mercurial, however you pronounce it, Mercurial, and stuff like that, and Subversion, which is actually when I created it. And maybe for those listening also, because you talk about, you've made some references to working in research. Maybe can you give us a quick little background on that? Just kind of a quick 101 and like what kind of research type work you or have been involved with, and how that might differ from our general audience of primarily software engineers that may or may not be familiar with that.
I'm trained as a classical computer scientist. That was my education. And I worked in machine learning research for a bit. That was actually my first introduction to version control systems. And boy, that was a nightmare. CVS, not just a drugstore. And there's a difference in how you develop the software. Should there be? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. That's maybe a topic for another time. But there's a difference in how you develop, because a lot of software developed for research, even if it is made open source, which happens more and more these days, it's not going to be maintained. It can't. In a lot of cases, if it's supporting a paper, it can't be maintained because it has to stay exactly the same as the time as it was when the paper was published, or else there's no reproducibility possible.
We'll be back with our interview with Julia in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for listening to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please walk out to your front door, step, stoop, what have you, and shout, "Listen to Maintainable!" Or maybe you can just write a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Do you know anyone that I should maybe have on the podcast? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. Go! And now back to our interview. Interesting. So types of software projects where you might pull together a bunch of information data and generate some useful information for a research project, you kind of need that to be more of a snapshot in time. And they might open source that so people can see and verify that it's doing what it said it did. And I'm not familiar enough with this spectrum or this realm of the research world necessarily, but if you're going to release a paper or something, and so that kind of makes sense. So I'm thinking about these research type repository projects or repositories of code. You have a snapshot in time to kind of reflect what was part of the paper or whatever the output of that research project or program was. And so you make it visible for people so they can kind of verify that it does what it says it's going to do. How often in the research are you then using that to inspire new ideas or new research type projects? And how do you feel like that's different as an open source type of project? Is it just that it's shared code and it's publicly visible code, or do you find that people take that work very often and do other things with it. And if you don't need to worry about maintaining that software, it doesn't matter how verbose or not you are, and if you use the obscure features of a programming language.
So there are at least two different classes, I think. There's software that accompanies a paper, like we were talking about, in which case, oftentimes written by, or the software and the paper, written by grad students, written by, in some cases, undergrad students who are learning how to program at the same time as they're writing this software. And speaking for myself, I was a terrible engineer when I was doing research. I don't know. Have you ever apologized to someone picking up a piece of your code before? Because I have. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for the state this is in. It's terrible.
Have you ever had experience where you didn't feel that way on any software project?
Yeah, good point.
It's always, I have conversations with some companies, and they're basically asking if I can come in and help do a little bit of like software engineering team therapy. I mean, I'm not a therapist, but a little bit of like helping with their team. Like, hey, we think there might be someone on the team that like they kind of get a sense that maybe they're ready to probably leave, but they're not leaving the company yet. And then you kind of learn more, and you're like, oh, they just feel really like they don't want to leave everybody kind of in a weird lurch, in this weird situation. They're like, yeah, I know, like the code is like this, and if I had had more time, I would have done more of this. And there's just a lot of like anxiety about like, I'm sorry, for the state of things. I wish there was more tests. I wish there was more documentation. I was working by myself on this for 6 years, and it's just, and you'd be like, it's okay. Like, that's normal. Like, I hear these stories all the time from people. You're doing the best you can with the time you have available. At least we hope you were, but it is what it is. And so we can't change the past, but what can we do about it now? Always trying to help people feel better about like, you can probably leave that project and go elsewhere. But, I think about, just circling back to software maintainability and open source stuff. You had also mentioned, in part of our prep for this, that you work in closed source projects, I'm assuming, within organizations, and open source projects. And do you find that there's any fundamental different? Do you see a lot of like do you see parallels to how software is maintained in those two different contexts? And I'm thinking, and maybe setting aside the research type projects for a moment, and just be like an open source project that some decent number of people out there are contributing to versus an internal project where multiple people are also contributing into it.
From a technical angle, there are definitely differences. Oftentimes, you'll have more opinionated style guides in closed source repositories than you do in open source repositories. And I know that people will say, no, definitely, we have a style guide. And yes, but the social levers and the power dynamics are so very different between open source and closed source that it is much easier to get adherence to a particular style guide in closed source repositories than it is in open source, in my experience.
Is that a good thing?
Well, that is a great question. And I think it's arguable. On the one hand, I think that stricter adherence to a style guide leads to more maintainable software. On the other hand, maybe closed source projects should have better understanding of power dynamics and be a little bit more flexible. I think you can make the argument both ways. It's just a matter of if there's a carrot or a stick behind the decision maker. And in open source, it's largely a carrot. In closed source, it can be a stick. It can also be a carrot, depending on the health of the organization. But I think as a crunchy granola open source hippie, I am supposed to universally say that everything should be done in an open source style. Like, that's the absolute best way to go about it. But in practice, like, there are things to be admired from both styles. And as always, it really just depends on the project, the goals, and the people involved. And that's inherently uncomfortable for people because there's no right or wrong answer.
I'm curious about when you're working on projects, and what have you seen work well for, let's get into the weeds a little bit, but like, do you ever use the metaphor technical debt very often? And how would you define that today? And do you feel like it's vastly different at all from how you might have described it 10, 15 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so technical debt. I do use that phrase quite often. And I think how I define it now is a lot more broad than how I used to. The way that I think about it now is work that you have put off, and that's really it. I don't constrain it to, oh, I need to write tests, or, oh, I need to do this refactoring. It's just work deferred, or I guess work incurred, maybe, too. I think at the start of my career, which was a while ago, I would have probably defined it a lot more strictly around the specifics of the code base. And now I kind of see code as the output of software engineering, not software engineering itself. Yeah, it's the artifact. And so I will include a bunch of things in the area of technical debt now, including program management, including process management, that probably people don't often include as part of their technical debt. Cultural issues, I think, also pop up in technical debt conversations these days, because when we think about all of the inputs into creating that software artifact and what either makes it easier or harder for people to do their work, cultural issues pop up. If you've got somebody that constantly nitpicks on code reviews in a meaningless way, it doesn't really add anything, they're slowing down the process. They're maybe driving people away or making it a less great place for the person who wrote the code to do their work. And that winds up contributing to issues within the code base in general. And so that's a cultural issue that I would consider to be part of technical debt.
Yeah, so you get kind of like this organizational team debt, things that are kind of a little bit more upstream, kind of getting back to some, like root causes of maybe what's contributing to these things and allowing. It's always this interesting thing when I'm talking with, different teams about their technical debt. Do they have a backlog of things, or their team has a list of things that they're like, we know we need to take care of these things. And I'm like, you're always like, well, what contributed to this? Is it just time? You didn't have time, pressure, something you needed to make some concessions. And then you find that they just kind of feel like, well, the product owners don't understand, because they're thinking about like, these things are slowing us down to get stuff pushed out. And they'll often point at the tangible like code things, or like it's our deployment process, or our CI stuff is a little flaky, or what have you. All these, we're outdated on some versions. We're not able to use new things. We're still using this old thing from 12 years ago. All these different things that they're pointing to. And they're like, well, the product team won't give us time to do this because they're always ship, fast. But then it becomes like this us versus them sort of mentality that will start to appear. And then I'm always thinking like for the people listening right now, and they're like, well, I might have brought this up and I heard not right now too many times, and they stop asking. And that's a cultural, organizational problem. It's keeping the technical debt growing. And do you have any advice for people in those kind of situations on how to like navigate those types of conversations? Do you find that you've witnessed or been part of how maybe you can reflect on times that you've tried to advocate for time to work on addressing some of these issues, whether it be team issues versus actual code improvements, and just weren't very effective at it?
It requires a little bit of taking a step back and figuring out a bit more about the human side of things, because ultimately it comes down to motivations. If the limitation is, well, the product team needs to ship, then you know what the motivation is there. And you can use that motivation to make the case. So where I've seen people be a bit more successful in advocating for breaking or for prioritizing technical debt is putting the work in terms of the motivator. And that's extremely poorly phrased. But if to take that concrete example of the product team just wants us to ship, they don't want us to draw down on the technical debt, then taking the information you have about your current debt, saying, well, if we continue at this pace, here are the real world consequences. You're going to be able to ship features X% slower, or we are going to have a reckoning come July 18th, right? When everything's going to crash down because we haven't fixed this bug, or being able to put it in terms of what the decision makers are prioritizing and care about. And that requires some understanding of the nuance and understanding of the power dynamics, etc. When people try to use levers like, we have 118,000 bugs that are outstanding, and I'm just picking that number out of a hat. I hope nobody has that many on their plate right now. But if we have an absurd number of bugs in our code, and that's the information you're presenting, that's not a compelling argument, because it says nothing about the severity, and it says nothing about the impact of those bugs. And so people often think that dashboards of issues or dashboards of performance or whatever is a compelling argument. And the fact of the matter is it's not. Dashboards are never a compelling argument in isolation. They always need that context. They always need the context of what it means as impact and what the sources of the data actually are. So context is key, I think, is the takeaway there.
And out of curiosity, when it comes to dashboards and data, what data metrics do you find most valuable to track with regard to the health of your software delivery cycle?
I think they're all bad. No, I think it really depends. I have a very complicated view of metrics in software development. I track research around this, and one might think that our intuition around what metrics are good and bad in software development are well informed, and we have all of this experience as software engineers. We understand what the metrics should be or the metrics mean, but the research typically shows that our intuition is wrong. So the famous example, and this is from quite a while ago, is the whole lines of code thing. How many lines of code are in a file, software repository, person's contributions, what have you? And ties back into our first conversation about clever code. It's kind of meaningless because people's thought processes, people's styles of writing, there are so many factors that go into something that impacts how much code is produced. More code isn't always better. Less code isn't always better. And so we've got these statistics from open source, from closed source. We have people being reviewed on how much they commit to a repository, a project, and that's used in how they're judged for performance reviews, etc. It's used in how they gain trust within an open source community, and it's meaningless. It's completely meaningless. It doesn't reflect on the value of their contributions at all. And we know this because of research from when I think it was IBM started judging employees for how much code they produced and the code that they added and removed and the subsequent studies about that. So go back to the whole context is key. The metrics depend on, useful metrics depend so much about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what your goals are. It's not just what you can observe. And people over-index on what you can observe.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. Just want to take a moment to plug my own company. That's right, Planet Argon, who also helps produce this podcast. We are a software consultancy. We specialize in helping organizations with existing Ruby on Rails applications make them better and more maintainable. Hence, maybe the podcast, Maintainable. We enjoy rolling up our sleeves and helping organizations with a lot of legacy debt, technical debt, and help get things back on track. If your team is struggling to figure out how they're going to get things updated or want to take advantage of some new features or just need to really improve or refactor some areas of your code base, get in touch with us at planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. Tell them that I sent you. I sent you. Tell me that I sent you. Tell yourself to tell me that I at Robby at planetargon.com. sent you to our own website. Let's get back to the show. I feel like that's an interesting kind of way to kind of frame that. And the challenge that some organizations may have is not having enough of like, how do you get into this sort of like objective versus subjective view of like, what's your perception of your people on your team and like how they're contributing? And you say a manager, we want to, believe that most managers can keep a good tab on like what their team's doing and understand all the things that are going well, things that they need to work on. And then you're looking on the outputs and sort of impact that they're having. And how do we get to a point where we can have some reliable data to support our observations of our peers or coworkers or people that we're managing? Because some people might be really effective at participating in Jira conversations on a regular basis, and that could be really great. But they could also be the one that's slowing things down because they're going back and forth all the time. Or you have the other person that has a lot of commits. That might also mean that they're skipping the conference and like they're having to rework a lot of things. And so you have like, oh, look, this person has the most commits in this repository. It was a lot of that work actually rework and bug fixing for things that they did because they didn't ask clarifying questions and get more information from our client before they delivered. They pushed out some code. A lot of back and forth. Or maybe they just like smaller commits and they didn't squash it or whatever. And they just have a different way of thinking about how often they save and commit and make changes to their code. So there's more volume of commits for that person. And so those metrics are taken with a grain of salt. But at the same time, a lot of us don't have a lot of things that we can kind of look at and be like, how do we effectively provide some consistency to how we measure the impact that all of the team members are having, so it's not catered for every single person? And then someone coming in and taking over, rather, not only do people come in and inherit code, you also sometimes inherit a team when you're a manager, and that's who's doing what, who's made an impact. And so it's hard stuff, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And I think that the key that I always try to remember is that when we are trying to evaluate anything, metrics are part of it. They're not the whole story. And when we are trying to establish any metrics, we need to take a close look at what we are measuring. Because if you want to know how the team is doing, commits isn't necessarily the metric you need to use, right? That is a measure of what they are doing. It's not a measure of how effective they are. And so we gravitate to these easy to grasp metrics, the things that we can query a database for, we can write a script to compile some pretty numbers for us. But oftentimes that is actually grabbing artifacts, not what you're trying to measure. And so figuring out what the signals are for how you're measuring and what you're trying to measure, it takes more work up front, but I think that it typically pays dividends for teams that do it well.
I recently interviewed Kyle Diggle from GitHub and asked him about metrics. And he had a similar kind of thought around that, some of these artifact type metrics maybe not being as valuable as just like asking your development team, getting more developer experience type related questions about how they're feeling about things at this right now and regularly polling them on those things, and that tending to be more valuable because everybody, you kind of want to believe that your team, your developers, they want to do good work. They want to be productive and feel like they're making an impact, and what they're doing is providing value to the organization. And here's some of the barriers that they might have for slowing them down. So that's something like DX scores, and there's frameworks around those types of things as well. But it is an interesting topic. But in the spare time, I have a few quick last questions for you, Julia. So number one, I like to ask people, do you have a non-software, non-technical, non-programming book that you tend to recommend to people?
I would say, I think that Feminism is for Everybody. Bell Hooks is one of the ones that I recommend.
I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes for everybody and take a look at that myself as well. Final thoughts, as you reflect on like what's coming up in the world, and we strayed away from anything, AI and ML related, but I'm curious, do you think that with some of these new developer tools that software maintenance will become easier for developers in the next few years, thanks to some of these tools?
In the next few years? No. And I'm specifically focused on the maintenance aspect, not necessarily the creation. I don't think software maintenance is going to be easier. And I actually just read a paper on this about using, and I'm going there, so you can blame me, about using large language models for fixing bugs in existing software. And it was not a promising paper. So I think that there's, and that is because there's so much more that needs to be understood about the existing code base than that can be reasonably held within the model and the context window. So I hope that it gets to that point, but I don't think it's going to be within the next few years.
You heard it here first. She doesn't think it's going to be all that helpful for us in the next few years, everybody. So you're going to have to keep exercising those brain cells and figuring this stuff out. I find that when I am using things like Copilot and experimenting with things, it can be helpful in helping me understand a bit of code a little bit quicker. Like, what is this doing? But yeah, I have yet to see it be like, okay, help me upgrade to this project and just figure it all out for me so we can get to the latest version of Ruby or whatever the programming language you're working in. So sounds like a dream still, but maybe one day we can automate some of this stuff.
We've come a long way since I started working in ML. So I won't say definitively no, but like it is my estimate that we've got a ways to go yet.
Which is okay, because I identify myself more as a mender than a maker, and so I like improving things. And if the bots want to take over the blank vanilla canvas of a new app and build out the first few versions, great. They can have that work. I'm not as interested in that myself. That's just me. But there's a lot of people out there being like, no. But that's why but maybe not. That's just me. But there's a lot of people out there being like, no. But that's why maybe not, because they're listening to a podcast about maintainable software. And with that, Julie, it's been so glad to have you join us today on Maintainable. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop.
Thank you.